Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Chag Sameach. We're just sharing a few Purim highlights. It was wonderful to be with everybody and to have some joy and energy and dark times. It's always important. This week's parsha is Ki Tisa, and I'm going to do something different. Usually I have a source sheet free prepared, but I know that another thing that we like to do in this class is just open it up and discuss. So I thought we'd do that today, and I'll share some and share some of my. It has nothing to do with preparation. It has everything to do with approach and style. But I want to talk about the first thing that jumps out in this week's parsha, which is taking a census. And we know that there are there's an interesting Jewish take on census taking. What's different about the way that we take a census, the way we count people?
Backwards or some other way?
Okay, so Sheila says count backwards or some other way.
We don't count 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't count.
And why not? Why don't we do that?
I don't want to play.
Not.
Right. The evil eye, we don't want a plague. There's an instance with King David where there's a census taken and there's a plague, and it's right. God doesn't want, but why? Why doesn't God? What is so bad about assigning a number to somebody?
We're each ourselves, and so by being the prisoner, I'm not a number, free man kind of thing. Kind of counteracts that. We want to be a community of strong individuals rather than a community of a certain number only.
Right, a number undermines the humanity, right? That's the biggest prime example that we can think of in this room, of course, is the Shoah. When you brandish tattoo a number onto somebody. So, and Judy, Shabbat Shalom, welcome. Come on in, Laurel.
But this happened all before prisoners were marked.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't. The Shoah was not the first time, right? But certainly in our history, it's the most glaring example of
during the Middle Ages. But this was written like in 500 BCE, and already, I mean, I don't know whether the Egyptians marked people with numbers or not.
Right, and so we know that a lot of commandments come from don't replicate the practices of the Egyptians. That's why you don't shave the corners of your beard or make gashes in your skin for the dead, right? We're not supposed to replicate those practices. Good, so what is interesting about the phrase ki tisa et harosh? Not ha, ki tisa et rosh. That is when you take a census, but it's not literal in the Hebrew. What if you were to literally translate from the Hebrew, what does it mean? When you lift up the head, ki tisa et rosh, when you lift up the head, how does that change your perspective on what it means to take a census? Instead of when you assign everybody a number, it's when you lift up the head of an individual.
See the face?
You matter more, you see the face, right? We've just come from instructions about how to build the Mishkan, where we know that the Kruvim, the cherubim, must face each other, and that's where God appears. God appears when two faces are oriented towards one another. God appears from it, right? Where is God? This is, I was talking to the teens about this. God is the space between us. So ki tisa et rosh, no one in your community should be invisible, right? I don't know if anybody has done a homeless census before. I had signed up for one and didn't do it, and a friend very lovingly reminded me that the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Right, but when you the idea here, I think, is a radical notion of a different kind of society where nobody should be invisible. Right, when you take a census, you're lifting up the head. You are coming into relationship, into contact. You are seeing the eyes of another person, and you're seeing what it is that they may need, and that's community. So I think it's very interesting to see.
You're also seeing that they are alive.
Yeah, you're also literally seeing that they're alive.
Because right? But bent down and
oh, sure.
They've had cases like that.
Sure. Yeah. So there's literally a checking in with one another, right? It's the same thing with the half shekel. Right? You're not supposed to give a number. Everybody gives a half shekel, whether you're wealthy, whether you're poor. Everybody gives half a shekel, and you count that way. So again, it's if you're counting a minion, you might notice technically you're not supposed to say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we're good. You either right, but you could use a verse from Ashrei or from Psalms. There are certain 10-word phrases. Maybe any more for Dr. Seuss week. Yeah, you can go ahead.
I mean, this is of course what we always do. We take what's here and then find more meaning to it. But this was specific to males over the age of 20, for the army, for so
Right.
it takes on a whole different feeling when we're taking a sense of how many troops do we have? Which is different than our humanity.
Good. Okay, great. So let's draw a distinction here because first of all, if we're being realistic, what is the name of one of the books of Torah?
Numbers.
Numbers. So maybe we're not so against numbers, right? And we spend a lot of time, yes, we do take a lot of,
We're not numbered, days.
but that's exactly right. Well,
But
actually, it's
numbers,
right.
but numbers is the English.
Anyway.
of it.
It's Bamidbar,
Yeah.
which is a much better name for a book, right? Bamidbar, in the desert. Wouldn't you rather read a book called In the Wilderness than Numbers? Maybe I'm biased because I was always bad at math. Into the Woods, right?
Numbers is just a secret.
Became CPAs and actually.
Dina says maybe that's why so many Jews are CPAs. Topical, you know. It's that season. Mhm.
Ransom, is it really saying ransom?
Page,
Ron has a, oh, sorry, we're on page 523. 523, I should have started with the number. Was Ron is asking about ransom. Each shall pay the Lord a ransom. And anu ish kofer nafsho.
Only.
That's interesting, like Kippur. Kofer, I don't, yeah, interesting. Then anu ish kofer nafsho. I'm looking if there's commentary. A ransom for a self. Hebrew kofer refers to a monetary payment made to offset an incurred physical penalty. Apparently, it was taken for granted that a census jeopardizes the lives of those counted. This is what we were talking about, the plague that happened with David. Therefore, each individual must redeem his life through payment of a half shekel. So I think the ransom is for your life because you're doing something that threatens your life by taking a census. But great question. But Kofer, I think maybe there may be that. I'd have to look it up, but maybe there is that connection to Kippur because it is sort of an account for your life or a, it's interesting.
The king's coffers.
The coffers.
That's English.
But they might etymologically all be related. Okay, but I'd like to move on a bit. So what the big thing that happens in this week's portion is the golden calf, right? That is the episode that is considered one of the worst things we do in the wilderness. The other is the Korach rebellion, and you can actually debate which one is worse, which was the bigger crime, but certainly there is plenty of case to be made that the golden calf is the worst thing we do in the wilderness. And let's step that out a bit. What is so egregious about the golden calf and what's really going on here, right? We know Moses ascends the mountain. He's gone for 40 days. The people think what? The people think he's dead. And there's even a midrash that Hasatan, even though we don't believe in Satan like a big red demon with a pitchfork and horns, but there is a midrash that the Hasatan, the adversary or accuser, we see this angel in Job, right? It's not the fallen angel that Christianity goes off with in terms of painting a picture of Satan, but there is an adversary or accuser angel who shows them the image of a dead Moses, right? So there is this sort of being lured into temptation. This Moses is dead. You have no one else to lead you. You've been abandoned. And so they build a golden calf. The golden calf itself, what is it? If you're going to make any sort of molten image of God, first of all, it's always shocking that a people who has seen God, right, has seen the miracles, witnessed the plagues, the splitting of the sea, would build a golden calf, would engage in idolatry.
Told, don't do something.
Specifically told not to do it. So what is it? Why a golden calf of all things? What do you make of
Why a
that?
calf?
Yeah.
It's like the Egyptian bull gods that I forget which temple. But if you're busy building that sort of thing for the Egyptians, maybe you remember that in a very concrete way. And it seems to me that's one of the ongoing tensions of all of this is concrete versus abstract. And the people are basically saying, Moses was concrete, now we don't have him. We got to have something concrete. And yet God is telling us to think more abstractly.
So they need, it's that slave mentality. They need something tangible.
Yeah.
Maybe it's replicating the Egyptian practices. You were mentioning, David was mentioning the bull god of Egypt. So maybe there is reverting back to what you know. It's really hard to break yourself from what you've been raised in. Go ahead.
No other gods before me.
Mhm.
Haven't we gotten the 10 Commandments before this happened or no? Oh, they were coming down the mountain and he
Yes,
broke them.
yes and no.
Right. Yes and no, right?
We already heard the first one.
The Torah is not always chronological necessarily, and that is something that the rabbis wrestle with.
They're not saying that they want to have another God. They're saying they want to have a representation for God.
So that's the question. Is this golden calf in lieu of God, a substitute for God, or is it a representation of God? Also desecrating the commandments, which may or may not have been received at this
I
point.
suppose that depends on how you interpret this as your God.
Right.
But
When,
does it matter? Does that matter? whether
Right.
it's a
Are we splitting hairs at this
representation
point?
Or it is the God?
right, it wouldn't hold up in in a court. Yeah, go ahead.
I always like to specify which crime.
Yeah, go ahead, Nina.
To me, that most importantly, we've lost faith. Even though that we've been through Revelation, how quickly we gave up hope.
Yeah.
And decided Moses will never come back.
So the giving up hope piece, and I'll get to Bill, is interesting because there's a third incident that's also considered, it's in the running for the worst thing we've ever done, right? It's not a competition that it's fun to play, but what is the worst thing we do in the desert? Was it the golden calf? Was it the Korach rebellion? Or was it the incident of the spies, right? When 10 out of 12 spies come back from spying out the land and they say, we were like grasshoppers, we'll be slaughtered out there. Surely it's a good land. Look at these grapes. They're huge, but also the inhabitants of the land eat these grapes, right? They're monsters.
Right, also the complaining, I think.
Oh, the kvetching and
The
complaining. yeah.
kvetching on the legal goes back.
Yeah, right.
I think what
Not for
people
graves,
were
none of
talking-
graves in Egypt. Yeah, but so let me just finish this thought and then I'll get to more comments. But the reason that was so bad was a lack of faith, right? God has brought us here, and then 10 out of the 12 are saying basically we're going to get walloped, and it's only Joshua and Caleb who say, "Have the little faith. God brought us here. God is with us. We can do this, right?"
And we even said, sure, sounds great. You know, we'll do what you say.
Right.
And then we'll listen.
Na'aseh v'nishma.
And so how fragile.
Exactly.
Still.
So let's go, Bill, Ron, Sheila, and then I want to say one thing about what's interesting about the golden calf itself and what they may have intended by it.
Yeah, two comments. So, just said at the burning bush, what should I tell? How should you be known? And that's when we heard Yud-Heh Vav-Heh for the first time. And that's what the people continually called the calf in the text. They didn't call it by the generic, this is our God, it's our God Yud-Heh Vav-Heh. So there was a replacement theory here, but they weren't losing sight of who had taken them out of Egypt. They might be losing sight of the physical or the supernatural side of who they should be worshiping, but I don't think their intent was as far off as we often paint them. That's one, because they continually use that same name.
Got it.
So.
Right, they're not saying this is the bull god.
Right, it's not like we need a new God.
Right.
You need
They're using God's name to refer to the
Right.
calf.
But
Same name.
I take great solace in this whole incident, because if they had not done this, God would have taken the laws, Moshe would have brought them down. Here's what God said. We're going to do what God said, and there's nothing else going on. And this created this conflict immediately between God and Moshe. Moshe had to argue with God, don't kill them all. And then Moshe had to go down, and he ended up killing 3,000. God alone was not ruling the day. Immediately, when we're giving the Torah, people were engaged in, maybe not in a good way at first, but in interpretation and realization, taking it on for themselves. God, you're not going to kill everybody, but darn it, we're going to kill a couple people. We're going to hold accountability at a human level, one-on-one level, not just because it's your great word.
Great, so that's where we're going to head with the topic today, which is, had it not happened,
both God and man, not just.
Right, that's where we're going, right?
Right.
Had it not happened, we would have received the perfect tablets from God. We'll see what the difference is between the two sets. But ostensibly, before the calf, we were supposed to be like the angels. There was this opportunity to be superhuman in a sense. God is choosing this people, setting us aside for this unique destiny, but also, in a sense, to be right. We are supposed to be Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and that's still the case. We are still supposed to live up to that ideal. But I think before the golden calf, we were going to receive a Torah that literally was the property of the angels, right? There's another midrash, and I'm going to get to you, Ron, sorry, but there's a midrash where Moses ascends to heaven, right? When he goes up the mountain, there's a rabbinic midrash that he actually enters the heavens and is going to receive Torah from God there, but the angels protest. We studied this one in the midrash class. And God says, because the angels say, you would give a flesh and blood mortal the most precious Torah, which preceded the world, right? You created the world with Torah as a blueprint. You would entrust it to mortals, to flesh and blood? And God turns to Moses and says, defend yourself. And basically engage the angels in a battle of wits. By the way, it reminds me of in the movie Dr. Strangelove, when they go into the situation room, or not, into the the war room. Thank you, the war room. And there's a line, and I'm butchering it, but it was something about like, you're gonna let them in, but they're gonna see all our secrets. It was that kind of a thing. Like you're gonna give him Torah. You're gonna reveal all of our secrets, right? And so Moses engages in this battle of the wits, and the way he wins this battle of wits is he says, well, tell me what's in it. And the angels say, thou shalt not covet, right? And Moses says, well, what are you jealous of up here in heaven, right? Everything, right? What else does it say? Thou shalt not murder. And Moses goes, what do you need Torah for, right? You're perfect. You're right. We are flesh and blood. We're imperfect. We need this. And that's what ultimately wins him the debate, and he gets Torah and then comes down. But so Bill's point is, maybe it's not so bad that the golden calf happened, as much as we say it's one of the worst things, if not the worst things we do, because it leads to a paradigm shift or a dynamic shift between us and God, where God doesn't treat us as perfect angels. We're sort of saying, look, we're not ready for that. We don't want that. It's not what this social experiment of being alive is really about. We will continue to fall short, but we need Torah to help set us on that path to be better and to try harder. But we're not going to dispense with our humanity. We're going to lean into our humanity. Go ahead, Ron.
Okay, 10 minutes ago, you asked which we thought was worse, the golden calf or Korah. You started with
No,
those
he
two
says
anyway.
people discuss that. He didn't ask us to discuss it.
Oh, well, I'm discussing it. And I'm gonna say, based on the number of people killed, which I don't remember who died because of it, let me put it that way, not killed. I think the golden calf was more, right? I can't remember the numbers. But then you added in the spies, and based on the number who died because of that was everybody.
Right.
So maybe that was worse.
Right. So
But I'm not done.
I'm just going to reiterate for this, just so everybody here. If you're going by what was worse, maybe look to how many people were killed as a result. And Ron is saying, well, in the incident of the spies, the punishment was that this generation is going to die out in the wilderness. Helena, just in case you didn't know, you're unmuted. And if you want to say something, you can stay unmuted, but otherwise. Okay, so yes. So in that case, if you're looking at sheer punishment, everybody dies out because God says, you're not shaking this slave mentality. I can't start this new nation with you. I'll do it with your children. Go ahead.
Right, so the next part I was going to bring up is what had the most lasting impact? And I'll say that's the golden calf, because without the golden calf, we probably wouldn't have had the tabernacle. If we didn't have the tabernacle, we probably wouldn't have had sacrifice.
So I think Ron is saying here that without the golden calf, we wouldn't have had to atone for the golden calf, which many say the Mishkan was. Because if what we're going to do with our gold and our precious materials is build a calf, let's atone. Kofar, let's do Yom Kippur. Let's atone for that by donating our precious metals to build a Mishkan, a sanctuary where God can dwell. Right. So, and if you didn't have that, then you wouldn't have had animal sacrifice, which brings me to one more thing I want to say, and then I'll get to Sheila, which is, hey, that was a cool magic trick. Helena's here in person now.
She's still there.
You're still on that.
Wow. Two places that you've discovered how to be twice one. Okay,
I didn't realize I'm muted. I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Somebody said hello to me and I answered.
No, sure. Come join us. You have a seat? Can we get you a seat? I think we need one more. There are a lot here. Oh, thanks, Laura. Okay. So sacrifice. So there's something very interesting about the legacy of the golden calf, which is when Aaron is after this 7 days of investiture and the high priests are anointed and ready to serve in the tabernacle, Aaron, the high priest, approaches the altar. And the altar is comprised of 4 corners, but what are they? Horns. There are actual horns on the corners of the altar, having to do with the mechanics of animal sacrifice and all of that. And it says that Moses has to basically invite Aaron to approach the altar, which is an interesting shift, because remember when God tells Moses to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go, Moses says, I'm not a man of words, and God says, okay, Aaron will go with you. So there's an interesting shift that happens where first Moses needed that push from his brother, and now Aaron needs that push from a much more confident Moses at this point, saying, approach the altar. And the rabbis ask, why was Aaron hesitant to approach the altar? Does anybody know, given the hint?
It reminded him of the calf,
He was reminded of the calf because of
the horn.
the horns.
Yeah.
He was reminded of his own major sin because remember, Aaron is the one who builds the calf. The people are mutinying. They say, make us a god. And Aaron, who our tradition says, Rodef Shalom ve'ohev Shalom, Ohev Shalom ve'rodef Shalom. Aaron loves peace and pursues peace. Right? You would say, shouldn't Aaron have been liable for death for this? Why do we venerate Aaron when he's responsible for building the golden calf?
Yeah.
And the rabbis come to his defense and say, he was sparing the people from committing a much worse sin than building the calf, which is, they would have murdered him. They would have killed him. And so it's not cowardice, the rabbis say. It wasn't that he was it's not that he was spineless.
With self-defense.
It was, you could say it's self-defense, or going one further, it was defending the people. It was saying, I'm gonna spare you from having this horrible sin of killing your high priest. Right? So I will do this, not because I believe in the merit or worthiness of this cause, but because I want to spare you a worse sin. And so Aaron gets this reputation of pursuing peace, and we should be like the students of Aaron who pursue and love peace. But just one more thing I want to say, which is that there's an interesting moment here where Aaron has to, in a sense, in doing animal sacrifice, we always look at what is really happening here. Does God, like what Rabbi Dan Horowitz was saying, does God like the smell of barbecue, or something deeper going on here? I think there is an internal thing that Aaron needs to maybe slaughter, to use a violent analogy, in order to become the high priest, which is his own sense of inadequacy, right? The crushing weight of his guilt for sins past. What does he need to slaughter? Maybe literal calves and bulls, or, for animal sacrifice, but maybe it is, you have to slaughter the golden calf in you, right? You have to move on from your past, right? You are not, that does not need to define you, right? You can, in Judaism, you can do tshuva, right? You can, so he sees the horns, he's reminded of his own inadequacy, he's frozen, he's paralyzed, and Moses says, approach the altar, right? You're worthy. You can do this, right? And then he makes the sacrifice. Okay, we have a number of comments, but I think Sheila had the floor. Go ahead.
First of all, I love what you just said, the idea of teshuvah, that we move on. I think that is like the principle of Judaism, that,
Mhm.
once a year we have a chance to start fresh.
Mhm.
And that's,
If you do the tshuva correctly, yes,
yeah,
yeah.
and I think that's the
Okay.
beauty of our religion.
Mhm.
But what it's funny that Ron and I would be thinking along the same lines. I still think that the golden calf was worse. More people, I think, I'm not talking about how many were dead, but more people, I think, were involved in the golden calf
Mhm.
than in the other two. Is it relevant? I'm not sure. I mean, we're doing pilpul now. We're being Jewish and
Mhm.
trying to tear something apart. What was it? The second comment was that with the golden calf, they may have been thinking of the Egyptians had the king always had the was it the ass on his crown? He had a snake
Oh, okay, yes.
so that they could, when they're worshiping their
Mm.
god, their king, there was a representation.
Mhm. It's interesting, making me think of the snakes they had to make also to save them from the plague too. So there's an
Yeah, I
interesting,
mean, this is
Yeah.
what went on.
yeah,
But I'm, you know, this is a typical Jewish thing where we argue what's worse. And we
right.
do it today. We do it today.
Right,
We still do
absolutely,
it.
yeah. Hold on, there are a few voices we haven't heard from yet, and I will get to you, Ron, I promise. But, okay, let's go around this way, okay?
The history of mankind, there's not been some sort of programming that they say there were no atheists in foxholes to get them to recognize something greater, a
Right.
power, whether it's a stick or stone or whatever. Judaism talks about recognition of the God of Israel, but what is there about that? I think it's very fundamental that when things get rough, you look towards something higher.
And that's exactly what the rabbis say was behind that making the snake thing episode. It wasn't about the snake itself as a representation of God or an idol, but to get them to look up and remember their God in heaven. Go ahead.
I'm perplexed.
Mhm.
Aaron did a crime.
Mhm.
He built the Egel, Mizahav, and he didn't get punished for it. Okay, and Moses, who just hit with the on the stone, he couldn't get into Israel. Where is the balance? Where is I don't understand
where?
that tzedek.
Aaron's the favorite one.
Aaron's favorite child. But it's a great point, right? Moses, all he does is hit a stone twice,
Yeah.
right? But Aaron literally builds a golden calf. By the way, both are not allowed to enter the promised land. So you could argue that they both receive the equal punishment in that sense, that they can't enter the promised land. But it does seem like Moses's punishment is much more severe than Aaron's, who seems to get off scot-free here. What's interesting is the rabbis come to Aaron's defense and say he's pursuing peace and sparing them from a greater crime. And the rabbis rush to indict Moses. I think they need to make sense of the punishment, right? If God is righteous, then we have to understand what was truly. And I think there are a number of interesting responses that the rabbis make as to why Moses's crime was so bad. For one, both actually come down to idol worship. How? Obviously, Aaron's is obvious. Why is Moses engaging in idol worship here? Because when he hits the rock, because God says, there shall be no strange God betocham, within you. And the rabbis say, what do you mean within you? What is the strange God within you? And they answer, anger. Right? The rabbis don't like anger. If you look at emotions, especially the Hasidim, they don't like anger. They think that nothing good could come from anger. They don't like anger. And we can debate whether we agree or disagree with that, whether that makes us angry or whatever. But anger is the false God within you, because when you let anger take control, right, you basically, it's all consuming. You don't think rationally, you give up. So it's basically and what Moses does, it wasn't necessarily just that he hit the rock. It's what he says before he hits the rock. He calls them morim. He calls the people rebels. He says, listen, you rebels, should I? And God's like, whoa, 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 you are my representative to the people. There are plenty of instances where I get angry and where like this was not one of them. They're thirsty. Have a little Rahman, right? God did not say be angry at the people, but Moses went off script, yelled at the people, and then smacked the rock twice, which he's not told to do. He was told to speak to it, which you could say he gave up an opportunity to glorify God through the power of speech, God who creates the world through speech and not through violence. If you look at the other creation stories of other religious traditions, often it's, this God tore up the guts of that God, and that's how we got the skies. And then that, right? Ours is God spoke, let there be light, and there was light, and the light was good, right? So Judaism is about the power of words to perform miracles. And Moses is saying words in this moment are not enough. We need striking. It's the same word used when he strikes the Egyptian taskmaster. So it's almost as if Moses is undermining his own evolutionary arc from somebody who strikes the Egyptian, giving in to maybe an angry moment, whether he's right or not right to do it, right? He is an impulsive, angry person. And then in the end, after all this, after he becomes from, or else if at time, Torah should change us, right? It's almost negating all the ways in which Moses has grown and developed. Like we just talked about with Moses and Aaron switching, being who's the one who's the support system for the other. So you could say that what Moses did was actually worse than it seems. However, it's hard to read this and not feel bad for Moses, like he's getting punished too much. Like, oh, come on, he's been through so much and he doesn't get to enter the land. Okay, there's a number of comments and I've been talking for a long time. So I want to hear voices we haven't heard yet, and then we'll get to second helpings. So let's go to Jackie. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about it.
Another punishment, perhaps.
We can't
Visit the
hear
sins of the
anything.
fathers on the son. Yeah.
We
So
can't,
that,
I can't
Jackie,
hear
that's a
anything.
very, Jackie is saying, let's not assume that Aaron wasn't punished. We know what happens to his sons, Nadav and Avihu, right? Very hard to wrap our heads around a notion of a God punishing a parent through, right? That's horrible. That's the most horrible thing you could think of. But Jackie is saying Aaron suffers. You're saying Aaron doesn't necessarily get, you're sort of pushing back against what I said about Aaron gets off scot-free. He said, whether it's a direct punishment or not, certainly theologically, I don't believe that it was. I don't think that God does that. But it's a good point to say that Aaron certainly does not get off scot-free. Yes, keep going.
Question, it may be like from 10 minutes ago.
Oh, yes.
Which is, and it may be kind of tangential, but I want some feedback on it, which is, I go to this foot doctor who's very frum, and I was talking to him about Israel.
Looks at your foot.
And he said to me that he believes that if God wants Israel to exist, it's going to exist. So he does what he does, but he thinks it's that's what his faith tells him.
That's why the Orthodox don't need to serve in the army. God's gonna look after everything.
Yeah, and it struck me how unbelievably strong that faith is. And it made me wish that I also had that faith. I have some faith, but I believe more in the actions of men. What would you say about that? And how can one get more faith? Because maybe that can be kind of help you through the day.
Okay, beautiful. So this is going back to the conversation about the spies who didn't have enough faith and said, we're going to get walloped. And the question is, well, there's a certain beauty to having faith. And I think that as Jews, sometimes we might downplay that. Certainly wouldn't compare it to, say, Christianity, which is all about sort of keeping the faith and have the faith, right? But we don't sort of emphasize it necessarily, as at least in a mainstream way, as much. And maybe, or at least maybe in the more liberal streams of Judaism, conservative and reform and reconstructionists and so on. And the question is, what is lost in our sort of downplaying the role of faith? And is there a certain beauty there that we are not emphasizing enough? And it's interesting. we certainly have instances in our Torah when Nachshon jumps into the sea. That's
so
probably the
beautiful.
most, right? Just having faith and saying, I'm going to go up to my nose. And that is the combination of faith and action, right?
Right.
I know I've said this a number of times, but we have 3 responses when we're leaving Egypt. One is to kvetch and complain. The people say, was it for lack of graves that you took us out of Egypt? Another is prayer. Moses says, God, I'm in between a rock and a hard place here. What do we do?
So hit it.
God says, so hit the rock, talk to it. And the third response is Nachshon, who jumps in, who takes action. But it's it's a leap of faith, right? So it's not enough to complain, certainly. It's not even enough to just pray. It's not that Judaism says faith isn't important, but it's saying faith coupled with action. Take the Nachshonian leap of faith, not prayer alone, not faith alone, but the kind of faith that makes you take matters into your own hands, having the optimism that God will be with you if it's a noble purpose. So I think that's sort of, if you look at Zionism and Ben-Gurion's decision to declare a Jewish state down to the wire when everybody else was saying, don't do it, right? And we will get walloped. We are like grasshoppers. We're surrounded by, right? We're like grasshoppers.
You might
Right?
also.
But to take that leap of faith, not to say God will, we don't have to enlist in the army because it'll be covered, right? All we have to do is study Talmud and God will that. We are the real heroes, right? We're the real soldiers. It's different. It's saying, no, we are going to take, this is a secular movement. Ben-Gurion was no dati, right?
Right.
But to say, that doesn't mean it's a combination of we have to take matters into our own hands, but only if God is with us will we be able to succeed.
That's where it's also, you could argue that it's a false dichotomy. Faith and action aren't necessarily opposites at all.
Mm-hmm.
No.
And if you look at the Torah and subsequent history of the Jews as depicted through Tanakh, it would seem that there weren't anybody who considered themselves so frum they would refrain from action.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, they were so frum they jumped into action.
Exactly, right? And there's a famous debate in the Talmud, which is what is more important, Torah study or action, good deeds, right? And one rabbi says action, right? And we read that and we go, yes, right? Of course, it's not enough to be learned if you're a jerk. Right? You got to be a good person. That's Judaism on one foot is love your neighbor as yourself, right? The Hillel Shammai. But then another rabbi says, I know we got a lot of comments. But then the other rabbi says, no, Torah study, because Torah study will lead you to action, right? So it's how do we get both? Okay, we're going around this way. That's how we're going to do it. So go ahead, Nina.
I just noticed when Moses comes down from the mountain with the sacred tablets of the Ten Commandments.
First time, second.
And
The first.
I'm sorry, first time on page 534. And in English, it says he became enraged and then hurled the tablet.
Mm-hmm.
Where's God right now? Because he punished him for hitting the rock, but yet these were inscribed by God himself. Carries these sacred tablets down, and because of his anger, which is a real no-no, there's no God here. And there's no, is that part of the punishment perhaps why he didn't enter the land? It's never come up.
Nina's asking, this seems like an exact scenario of hitting the rock where first there's anger followed by smashing rocks, right? Here Moses gets enraged and then hurls the tablets. So why is that okay? Why doesn't God, where's God here? Why doesn't God get upset about this? The rabbis, in this case, rush to Moses's defense. And they say that actually, because one of the things Nina said is, if you drop a sitter, you're picking it up and you're kissing it. Tablets that were written and carved by God, and you can smash, you can shatter. The rabbis say that a miracle occurred and the letters flew off the tablets before he dropped them. So he didn't actually desecrate God's sacred words. They also say things about like it wasn't him. It was like the angel. It wasn't him really. It fell from his hands. It was something that was not an accident but it wasn't actually. It was caused by something else, right? So They are troubled by exactly what you're troubled by, and they say that, well, it didn't actually happen that way because the letters flew back to their source first. Because once they desecrated it, once they said basically, you know, we're not interested in this, we've built a golden calf, then the letters kind of, it's like the terms, well, you've broken the contract, and now, you know, it sort of goes back to its original source, divine source. Great question. Okay.
I don't know if we're gonna add that much now because we've had some great discussion, but I've always seen the diaspora rabbis as the domesticators of Judaism. And aligning with Aaron makes so much sense for them because that was he was the ritual guy, the priest. Rabbinical Judaism kind of carried on in that vein. And I think, you know, at the time of the writing, as Sheila pointed out, they wanted to present Judaism in a certain light. And I think overall, our rabbis throughout the ages, and this is a dichotomy we face, are we going to be Judah the lion, or are we going to be the pussycats? And I think we've existed over a longer period because we've been somewhat domesticated. We've been quiet, we turn a little more inward. We're not fighting all the time. And that's the concern here. Now you have a land of Israel. Now the lion raises its head again. Now we're back to wars. And war can wipe out a people. Now, being quiet wiped out 6 million people too. So, you know, maybe you're never safe, but in terms of longevity, you can, I don't want to say fly under the radar, but, you know, so you observe the mitzvot and you do all those nice, quiet things. And faith brings emotion. And observance of halakha, and it's probably more an Ashkenazi thing, but observance of halakha rationalizing, it's all thinking. Or a lot of it is thinking. So I think that's the balance, is that domestication versus wild.
It's very interesting. Oh, thank you. That's nice. The domestication versus wild thing, I promise we'll get to everybody. We're going to go around this way. Domestication versus wild, and then we'll get Nelson as well. I know you've had your hand up for a while. And what is in our best interest to survive, even just strategically, let alone for our character or what we are in the world. And maybe it's some kind of combination of both. And you can find, right, if you look at in our own sort of history of Zionist thought, which is diverse, right, very diverse. You have the Max Nordau, muscular Judaism. Jews have to hit the gym. We can't be these nebbishi yeshiva buchers. Like, we need to defend ourselves. We have Jabotinsky, right? We have these kinds of, and then you have on the other end of things, Ahad Ha'am, who says we need a Merkaz Ruchani, we need a spiritual center, right? Don't emphasize that the body, the spirit needs to come first, right? Then the body, but Herzl's like, no, we need a body first for our own protection, right? It's a question we've been wrestling with forever. And there's also George Steiner.
Ever wrestling, because we have at times the opportunity to be that domestic component.
Right, whether you even have the opportunity, like whether right before Israel, there wasn't even a choice, right? The modern state of Israel. But one more thing I wanted to say, that there's a thinker on the other side of the spectrum, very opposite of the sort of Max Nordau muscular Judaism, George Steiner, who wrote a piece called Our Homeland, the Text. And he argues that we're actually, as a people of the book, we're only safe in the text. And once we busy ourselves with with statecraft, and I know there will be a lot of us will react very strongly and negatively to this idea, but he's saying that it actually, we then have to, what a Jew then has to be concerned with is the lethality of our jets, our fighter jets, and all, you know, statecraft and all the surus that comes with it, and it distracts us from being a people of the book, and what are we actually meant to be as a people, and what are we actually supposed to be
what to do in the land?
Busy with. Doesn't the book tell us what to do with the land? Yes. But there was one more.
What does he make of that?
Yeah, good. So you can push back in that way. But there was another point that he makes, which is that, what was it? Oh, if you look at the text, 90% of it is wandering. Right, 90% of it is being a people of the diaspora, of longing for Israel and wander, but only about 10% or less is actually spent in Israel when we then mess it up and then we're exiled. And right, so he's saying that we are a people of wandering and not of arrival. He calls it the problem of arrival. Right, that's sort of the innovation, and you could look at companies like this too. Right, when you are number 2. You are innovating like hell, right? I guess there is I shouldn't say it. Well, hell's okay, right? Okay. like heck. You're innovating because you want to be once you've arrived, once you are number one, then you get, let's make iPods even smaller, right? It's sort of like, what you sort of lose that innovative. So I think he's also sort of saying that there is something about the Jewish character that thrives when it's wandering and when it's longing and when it's striving, and that struggles when it's arrived and when it's now distracted by the demands of statecraft. Yeah, right. Right. But then what about Israel being a startup nation? So that's great. Hold on, Ron, we have a lot of comments. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to anger. When Moshe, when the excuse is that Moshe doesn't go into the promised land, Israel, whatever you painted at that time, because of his anger and hitting the rock, I'm gonna say, well, what was God's punishment all the times he got angry and was gonna kill all the people and Moshe had to talk him down?
Okay, so is it fair that God might punish Moses for being angry, and yet we have many instances where God is cannot, right? God is a jealous God. God is incensed, right? Apecha, what precedes it? Flaring the nostril. Anybody help me with the Hebrew? Apecha, don't. In Hebrew, the phrase for being angry is flaring the nostril. Apecha being your nose. Don't let your nose flare. We say it in our prayers and slichot, and it's in Torah. But yeah, don't get your nose bent out of joint. Comes from the same. Yes. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So, right, withhold your anger. Don't let it flare up. Right.
In the book of Samuel, before David would go into battle, he always felt he had to get God's permission to do it. And he'd go to the prophet, whoever it was, the
Samuel or Nathan, yeah.
And so he did not, and Saul was punished because he did not wait to get God's approval.
Okay, right. So Jackie's saying that before David would go to wars, he would make sure God was backing it, right? Go to either the prophets and Natan or to Shmuel to make sure that God was with them. But Saul wouldn't necessarily, and that's one of the things that differentiated them. That's a good point. But Ron's point is, why is God allowed to be angry and we're not? Right?
Because God is God.
Especially if we're created in God's image. Yeah. So it's a good question. I mean, I'd have to wrestle with that one.
I've got a little wrestle.
Okay, well, wait, I want to stay us on track.
Let's cast Jacob.
Yeah.
Not
Who had comments over here? Yeah, I'm gonna get to Nelson. I sort of see Nelson as over here, so I'm gonna keep going in order. Yeah, Elliot, you had a comment?
Oh, yeah, just this discussion about anger and words that we have, so Moses had such a great role, but yet Aaron was supposedly the spokesperson. Would you talk about this prelude to prayer? Are we asking God to empower us to use words instead of anger? What is that all about, what we say right at the beginning of prayers?
Yeah, I love that. So where that comes from, Adonai Sfatai Tiftach Lefi Yagid Tilatecha, actually does go back to David. When Natan, the prophet, so going back to Jackie, she intuited this question. That was pretty cool. Says, there's this guy, there's this shepherd, and he has one sheep. And then there's this other shepherd's got a whole flock, right, and very wealthy. And this shepherd stole this poor other shepherd's one sheep that this shepherd. And David gets mad. How could this person should be liable for death? And Natan goes, that person was you. And David realizes that he took Bathsheba from Uriah the Hittite, right? And he says, Adonai Sfatai Tiftach Lefi Yagid Tilatecha. When he realizes his guilt, and he's speechless. Right, going back to Aaron feeling guilt over the golden calf and the sense of inadequacy. How can I serve in this holy function? I'm not worthy. David has that moment too, when he realizes his guilt. And his response is, God, open my mouth that my lips may declare your praise. I don't have the words. Help me find the words. And imagine if we approach our Amidah each time from that place. And I think that's why the rabbis put that there. To say, not feel guilty and recognize your guilt, but have that kind of need to connect with the divine in this moment, or that sense of humility, and that's where prayer comes. Let God find the words if you can't. And that's why the rabbis write it down for us. We have it written.
I've always looked at this much more simple than we're discussing here. I'm looking at, God gave directions to Moses, and Moses, like most men, didn't follow directions. So
Yeah.
if you don't follow God's directions, you get punished in some way.
Right.
If you don't follow this book, you get punished in some way.
Yeah.
That's how I look at it.
So it could just be cut and dry. Moses hit the rock twice. God said to talk to it. You didn't follow the instructions. And there's something about, well, look, we're human, right? It doesn't seem fair. But maybe those who are our greatest, our leaders, right? The people who inhabit the highest posts in our society, they're judged to a higher standard, right? Because of what they're meant to be by virtue of that position, right? So whereas if it was some, any B'nai Israel, any Israelite had, failed to follow God's instruction, although there are instances where God lashes out at the stick collector, or who was a random person, or the person who steadies the ark when it's shaking. So maybe it's not correct that God judges the leaders more harshly than the hoi polloi. But I think there is a case to be made that you're judged harsher if you should know better, right? If you I've seen face to face. You I judge by a different standard.
Okay, so two things, one about Moshe and one about Aaron. So with respect to Moshe, we always learn that he's the most humble. But an example of lack of humility, leave aside anger might not be a good trait, or it might be only supposed to be used in very limited circumstances. We talked about the anger here. We haven't talked about what it actually says in the text, which is that he's being punished for not hallowing or sanctifying God in the midst of the people. So you say to yourself, well, you struck a rock twice, and he's already struck a rock earlier in the story, so possibly mean. And I've always struggled with that, and the discussion today is at least helping me maybe struggle a little less, or struggle in a different way, which is to say, okay, if the problem is you didn't hallow God in the presence of the people, and maybe here I'm channeling Rabbi Harlow and his commentary and his Machzor. He says that all idolatry ultimately is worship of self objectified. So in a sense, maybe that's what Moshe is doing by getting angry and striking the rock, because now it's suddenly Moshe, here, I'm doing my trick again, where I strike the rock and you get water.
Interesting.
And he's doing it on top of everything else with anger, but leaving aside the anger, it's maybe the lack of humility. So in the end, he not only doesn't get to cross over, but he's buried somewhere up on the mountain in a place nobody can find. And up until the point that he strikes the rock, there doesn't have to be a worry that anybody's going to worship Moses necessarily, because he's the most humble man and everything is God. Moses would probably be the first person to say, of course I don't appear in the Haggadah, because God did all of this. I'm just, here to represent and carry out orders, et cetera, and so forth. So now you have this situation where he can't cross over because he didn't magnify and sanctify God. He magnified and sanctified himself. And then with respect to Aaron, as a pursuer of peace in the context of the golden calf, what he says when Moses comes back, I threw in the gold and out popped the calf. So you have to deal with the fact that he says that himself, but in reality, you have to collect all this gold, and that takes a certain, I think there's even a midrash on this, but I can't remember where it is.
It says here, he actually formed, he made the mold.
Yeah.
He tells Moshe, oh, it just popped out of the fire.
So the point that I'm trying to make anyway, and as I said, I think there's a midrash somewhere, and Rabbi, you can help me with this if there is. I seem to have studied it somewhere. But you have to collect all this gold, and then you have to make the mold. And then you have to melt down all this gold. And all this takes a certain amount of time. And in
Yeah.
the back of your
Right.
mind, you're saying, come on, Moses, come on down the mountain already before I have to actually pour this into the mold and open the mold.
Great. So maybe it was a stalling strategy, right? He could have made something much simpler. He could have made something that didn't, but it says, okay, I'll make you your God. Come on, right? Well, we got to make sure that it's I got to get this neck right. And,
And that in reality is also, in a sense, Rodef Shalom, because if Moses had, if
By
he had
time.
taken the full 40 days, which I guess Aaron didn't really know how long that was going to be, then maybe Moses comes down before the calf is finished.
Right.
And we can dispense.
yeah, so there you
with it.
go. So maybe that's also what Aaron was trying to do in order to avoid sin here. Yeah. Nelson, you've had your hand a long time. Go ahead.
Well, we were primarily, I think, engaging in trying to decide what was the worst thing to do. And we're told not to judge the mitzvot. We don't know which are important and which are not. But I think one of the dangers of judging what's worse is you begin to trade. Well, that's worse than this, so I'll do this rather than that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you make an excuse to do something that's really wrong. So I think it's a danger. And we're human. We fall for these dangers. And one of the things about God, he's supposed to be perfect, so he gets embarrassed in a way in which we don't. So if he's really making a mistake, I don't think he really argues with Moses. I think he's engaging Moses in learning about himself. And so that's a different take on what's going on in their disagreements.
It's really a couple of responses. And one is that idea, going back to the question of, is it okay that God gets angry when God really doesn't want us to get angry? I think you could make the case that there are certain behaviors that God reserves for God's self, but doesn't want us engaging in. Right. And there was a rabbi who talks about the slaying of the firstborn of the Egyptian, right? The 10th plague. Right. And when does it happen? Middle of the night. And what does God instruct us? Stay in your homes. Right. So there's a rabbi who says God doesn't want us to learn violence. And this goes back to what Bill, what you were talking about, the balance between being the sort of domesticated cat versus the lion of Judah. And what are we supposed to do? What does the world thrust us into having to be, right? All this stuff. But God, according to this rabbi, was saying, I handle the violence because you should not, right? I know how to wield it correctly or the way that I'm, but I don't want you to have to bloody your hands. Right, so I and no angel, I personally will slay the firstborn Egyptian because this is what needs to happen because they threw your firstborn into the sea, and this is how Pharaoh's hardened heart. Right? This is how this is the path towards liberation. It needs to happen. It's not something God relishes in, right? God says, "Why are you rejoicing? My people are drowning in the sea." We know that God is pained by this, but God can take that action into God's own hands. However, we're not meant to. So maybe that could be one answer to why is God allowed to get angry and not us? Because God knows how to wield it, but we don't. Go ahead.
Teaches restraint.
Yes, right.
But
Wait, let a new voice. Yeah.
not only staying in the house, but we got to put some blood on the doorpost so he passes over our house.
Right.
But I'm troubled by the rock.
Okay.
Other than foretelling shale oil.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just speak to a rock, and it's rockets down. And when we had the plague, we had to look up to the medical symbol.
Yeah.
Making a stick. So,
right.
Is this a test for Moses to obey God? Why a rock? And it's almost a form of idolatry. I need water. The God of the rock is a water.
It's a great question. Why the rock? And I think for one thing, it just on its surface, to me, it seems like it is a hard, dry thing that does not produce water, right? And to say that God is going to perform a miracle, I'm going to be glorified amongst the people, because not through any action, not through hitting a rock, which you might say, oh, well, maybe by hitting it, you've weathered it, and maybe there was moisture from the rock that's being released by hitting it, whatever. God said, there cannot be a scientific explanation of this. It needs to be a miracle that I'm performing in order to be glorified to the people. So talk to it, which is impossible to yield water from a dry rock. So that's sort of why I think it's a rock and why it's talking to it. Why it's looking down versus looking up, I don't know. I've never thought about that. It's a good question. But I do think it just has to do with, you would never have water here. Although on one of my many trips to Israel as a teen and going to Ein Gedi, and you see what really looks like water gushing from a rock. And so there's something miraculous just about that land itself. That's, yeah, go ahead.
Going back to the violence thing.
Uh-huh.
Why then were the Levites the ones that killed the perpetrators of the golden calf?
Mm-hmm.
But not everybody. Only they, and they didn't end up with land, right?
Yeah.
So
So
agents on
the answer I'll give you is the answer that a rabbi gave me when I asked that rabbi the same question, which is, if God didn't want us to learn violence, then why does God command us to do a lot of violent things when we get to like, and he said, well, because the golden calf, so thank you for bringing us full circle. Once we did that, we ceased to be angels and became human beings again. And so that ideal of not having to learn violence, of being quote unquote angelic, no longer applied. We had insisted on being human, and so then we got a new set of rules, right? So I just want to end with one idea as we'll close here, which is, as some of us had mentioned, Moses goes up twice. The first time, God says, God both carves the tablets and inscribes them. So they're a perfect, this is why we're talking about it's meant for the angels, right? It's entirely the work of God. But the second time, God says to Moses, you carve the tablets and I'll inscribe. Same words that were on the first, but now humans have a hand in revelation, in receiving God's will. And so
it would have been even better though if all the people were involved in carving, not just Moses.
Sure, yes, but the people didn't want to, right? People say, you go, this is too overwhelming for us, right? But so the first tablets, which were completely the perfect work of God, were not meant for this world. They don't last long. They're immediately smashed. But the second one, which was a partnership, that's what endures. And I want to end with one story, which we have studied in our Talmud, in our Midrash class before. But God has this king, sorry, not God, but it's God, right? There's this king of flesh and blood and has two servants, both beloved. And he gives the servants both the same gift. It's a bundle of flax and a bundle of wheat, right? And says, here are my gifts to you. And they respond differently. The first servant keeps them safe, right? This is a gift from God. I'm going to make sure that if the king ever returns, that the king receives them in the exact pristine form with which I received them, right? So he keeps them on a pedestal, safe, make sure that they're in perfect condition. The second one takes the wheat, grinds it, kneads it into dough, bakes it into challah, and takes the flax, weaves it, cloth, makes a beautiful ornate tablecloth, puts the challah on top. Basically, it's a Shabbos table. And the king returns after some time and says, my servants, what have you made of the gifts that I gave you? What have you done with the gifts I gave you? And the first very loyal servant says, your majesty, here's the wheat, here's the flax, exactly. You'll notice there is no dust, there is not anything, nothing has fallen or been altered, it's perfect. And the king is a little disappointed, sort of head sinks a little bit. And then the second servant says, Shalom Aleichem, Shabbat Shalom, here's your challah and your tablecloth, and the king smiles. And the rabbis use this as an allegory for the written law and the oral law, right? The Torah, which is sort of given, it's sort of the flax and the wheat unaltered, but the challah and the tablecloth is what you make through that partnership. God wants you as a partner. And that's what the oral law is, right? That the Talmud, Mishnah, Midrash, it's God wants us not just to be passive recipients of Torah, but to have an active hand in ascertaining God. In that way, God, He Tisa, lifts our head, right? Elevates humanity. We are not just the subservient, passive recipient. We are God's active partner. It's why when you bow, Baruch Atah Ad Hashem, you lift your head. you bow, you certainly are, bowing and worshiping God, but you're also standing upright because it's our role to be God's active partners in the world.
So-
Shabbat shalom.